Let me ask a question. I apologize, I wasn't here at the beginning, but as you know, we're debating and redebating the issues related to the debt ceiling. I just have to say for the record, I am grateful this country has a statutory debt limit. I don't think we'd be doing this hard work right now if we weren't required to do it. So for those who argue against a debt limit, I would just say that if we didn't have the debt limit, as Senator Lee points out, we could be Greece. And so I'm grateful we're having the discussions. They are not easy to have. They are sometimes painful internally and externally, but I'm grateful we're doing it. We woke up this morning to the news that General Electric was moving some of its imaging jobs over to China. And there have been various theories put forward as to why that might be happening. But I think, you know, we get beyond the discussion of the debt limit and what happens with our spending. The bigger problem that we have, of course, is the joblessness that has been pervasive for the last 2.5 years and shows no sign of abating. And, you know, I'm from Texas. We're not doing as badly as other parts of the country, but I would like us to do a lot better, and I certainly want my country to do a lot better. When you look at the joblessness of the 20-year-olds, that is startling that we have a whole generation that may never know the value and reward of work. When you look at particularly the young people who are minorities, the joblessness rate is absolutely staggering. So now we're seeing jobs from a large, revered American company going over to China. And one of the reasons postulated is that it may be the tax code that is creating this impetus for this company to move those jobs. I was wondering, Dr. Mitchell, do you have an opinion about that?
There's no question that the U.S. corporate tax rate is among the highest in the world, sort of neck and neck with Japan for the dubious honor of the highest corporate tax rate among industrialized nations. I remember back during President Bush, he had a tax reform panel. I forget what the formal title of the tax reform panel was, but one of the testimonies to that panel, I think, was from the tax vice president at Intel, who said that the biggest difference in the cost of locating a plant in the U.S. versus, I think, Malaysia was their other choice, but I assume China would be similar, was not labor costs. It was taxation. That would be the #1 advantage for them to build a plant overseas. Now, obviously, maybe that would be different in a labor-intensive plant versus a high-tech plant, but I do think that our tax system is extraordinarily punitive to savings and investment in general, but then our corporate tax rate is very, very high, and it is the statutory tax rate that's the marginal tax rate on new investment and new profits for companies. So I do think it's important to look at that statutory corporate tax rate. It's just punitive and self-destructive.
So raising that rate, elevating that rate to add revenues to the Federal Treasury would be counterproductive?
Well, Kevin Hassett at the American Enterprise Institute, and I think along with Alex Brill, estimated that the revenue maximizing corporate tax rate was closer to 25% over the long run. So not only would it be self-destructive to competitiveness and job creation in the U.S., but it very likely might have negative impact on the amount of revenue government collects. Probably the greater danger is not so much a higher corporate tax rate. I haven't heard too many people talk about that. The greater danger is increased double taxation of saving and investment through increased double taxation of dividends and capital gains, and those, of course, have an impact on the decisions of people to defer consumption and to save and invest, and that, I think, is probably a greater danger, and that's more indirect, but could be just as injurious to our competitiveness.
Now, Representative Maloney talked about the fact that the tax rate effectively 15% of GDP, and that needs to be corrected. Wouldn't normally that correct over time?
If you look at the CBO 10-year forecast, I think if they assume, of course, a baseline of current law, which means the Bush tax cuts would expire. They show revenues climbing to over 19% of GDP by the end of the decade. If you assume that the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts are extended or made permanent, you'd still have revenues climbing up to about 18% of GDP, which is the long-run average. So, if you look at our long-run fiscal imbalance, it's not because revenues, at least in the medium and long term, will be below their historical levels. It's because spending has risen above its long-run levels. Historically, we had 20% spending, 18% revenue. Well, revenues are going to climb back up to 18%. and that's without any rosy scenario. CBO's estimates don't show any great growth. It's the spending that's skyrocketed.
Let me just quickly ask Dr. Reischauer a question, if I can, in my remaining time. Dr. Reischauer, we hear a lot of talk on, and you spoke about the social safety net to some degree. Representative Maloney talked about the stress being put on Medicare. Now, proposals have been put forward. There's been a lot of discussion about them. Can you tell us, is there a substantial difference between a voucher and a program of premium support?
This has become a semantic issue of some importance to people. I was under the impression that premium support, which I have some responsibility for coining the term in an article Henry Aaron and I wrote back in 1995, associated the payment to the cost, underlying cost of the service being delivered, whereas a voucher, in a voucher, that not necessarily was the case. That it, as Chairman Ryan's proposal suggests, would be associated with price increases, general price increases, not medical price increases. So that is the distinction that some people make.
And do you feel that it is a worthy distinction?
Oh, I think it's a very important one, especially when we're dealing with healthcare, which has tended to rise in our measured inflation much faster than other goods and services. I, for one, think that we have a bit of confusion in this because whereas inflation is usually measured as the increase in the price of a good or service adjusted for qualitative change, more often when we talk about medical care, there are huge improvements in quality or in the nature of the service. We can do things now that we couldn't do 10 years ago, and those aren't factored in appropriately. But our expectations as a nation is that everyone should benefit from whatever improvement and new technology comes on the market.
Thank you both
Thanks, Chairman,
very
for his
much.
indulgence.
No. That's called deficit questioning when you go beyond, the 5 minutes.